I walked into the Franklin County Probate Court with a black briefcase so thin it looked harmless. My father assumed it meant defeat, and my mother thought I came to beg when she stood there and declared, "She is a useless daughter." The judge studied my file, paused for several seconds, and spoke a sentence that paralyzed the room. They realized too late I was not there to plead. I returned to slam the door on their lifelong lies. My name is Adeline Lennox. I simply rested my hand on the case, breathing in the stale air of the courtroom, entirely ready to open the file that would unravel everything they had built. I did not bring a lawyer. I brought no entourage of supportive friends to sit in the gallery. I brought only myself, clad in a charcoal gray suit and a single, slim black briefcase that looked entirely too fragile for the war I was about to wage. The marble floors of the courthouse echoed with the sharp click of my heels, a steady, rhythmic sound that betrayed none of the cold, calculated anticipation coiling in my chest. Across the aisle, seated at the polished oak table reserved for the petitioners, were my parents, Harold and Diane Lennox. Flanking them was their attorney, Martin Weller. Weller was the kind of man who wore custom-tailored suits that cost thousands of dollars to small-town hearings just to remind everyone in the room who held the power. He had a practiced, confident lean, the posture of a man who had made a highly lucrative career out of bending ugly truths into easily digestible, sympathetic narratives. From the very first minute the bailiff called the room to order, the atmosphere was heavily performative. My father, Harold, sat with his jaw clenched, occasionally casting a sideways glance at me that was meant to convey righteous indignation. He was playing the part of the patriarch defending his territory from a greedy stranger who had just wandered in from the cold to snatch what was not hers. Beside him, my mother, Diane, was already working on her expression. She had perfected the look of the deeply wounded, betrayed matriarch. She kept a neatly folded lace handkerchief clutched in her right hand, dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes. The gallery behind us was half full, an unusual sight for a probate hearing on a weekday. But this was not just a squabble over a forgotten bank account. This was the Lennox family. In this small, insular town, the Lennox name meant something. It was woven into the local history through the ownership of a series of properties and the highly publicized Lennox Community Table, a local charity fund my parents managed. The people sitting on the wooden benches behind me were not there for a legal education. They were there for the spectacle. They had come to watch the prodigal daughter get stripped of her unearned inheritance. At the center of this gathering storm was the estate of my maternal aunt, Vivian Mercer. Vivian had been the sole owner of Mercer's Run Inn, a sprawling, aging property on the edge of the county line, along with a modest but legally complex private trust. It was not a grand, glittering empire, but to my parents, it was a lifeline they desperately needed to grasp. And standing in their way was me, Judge Eleanor Price, a woman with iron gray hair and a reputation for zero tolerance regarding courtroom theatrics, took her seat at the bench. She adjusted her glasses and nodded for the proceedings to begin. Martin Weller stood up, buttoning his jacket with a smooth, practiced motion. He approached the podium, resting his hands on the edges, projecting an air of reasonable concern. "Your Honor," Weller began, his voice a rich, resonant baritone designed to command trust. "We are here today to respectfully request the removal of Adeline Lennox as the executor of the estate of the late Vivian Mercer. This petition is not born out of malice, but out of a profound necessity to protect the deceased's legacy. For over 7 years, Adeline Lennox has been entirely absent from this family and this town. She did not visit her aunt during the final, agonizing months of her life. She did not contribute a single hour of care, nor did she offer a single dollar of support. She completely severed her ties with the Lennox family and the community at large. Weller paused, letting the silence hang in the heavy air of the courtroom, ensuring his words sank into the minds of the gallery. He turned his head slightly, offering a sympathetic look toward my parents. To allow an estranged individual, someone who lacks any working knowledge of the local business landscape or the intricate dynamics of the Mercer Trust, to step in and seize control of this estate would be a gross miscarriage of justice. Weller continued, his tone hardening. My clients, Harold and Diane Lennox, were the ones by Vivian's side. They are the ones deeply embedded in the fabric of this town. Miss Lennox is a stranger to her aunt's final wishes. She lacks the moral standing, the physical presence, and the practical competence to execute this will. I sat perfectly still. I did not shake my head. I did not object. I let his fabricated narrative wash over me, noting every exaggerated claim, every carefully constructed lie. This was their opening gambit, an attempt to establish me as a heartless opportunist. Then came the emotional crescendo. Judge Price, maintaining a neutral expression, looked over the documents in front of her and granted my mother permission to speak. Diane Lennox stood up slowly, her hands trembling just enough to be visible to the judge. She took a deep, shaky breath, playing her role to absolute perfection. She did not look at the judge. She turned her body and looked directly at me. Your Honor, my mother said, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. It breaks my heart to stand here today. It truly does. As a mother, you always hope the best for your children. But the truth is, Adeline has spent her entire life running away. Whenever things got hard, whenever this family needed her, she vanished. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, ensuring everyone in the gallery saw the physical toll this was taking on her. She never helped with the charity, Diane continued, her voice rising slightly, adopting a tone of bitter resignation. She never cared about the sacrifices her father and I made to keep our heads above water. She has never been useful to anyone in her entire life. She just takes and leaves. And now, she has come back to take from her poor Aunt Vivian. The courtroom was dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating vent above us. The gallery held its collective breath. My mother took one final, devastating pause. She stared right into my eyes, delivering the line she had undoubtedly rehearsed in the mirror for days. She is a useless daughter, Diane stated, her voice suddenly dropping its theatrical tremble, turning sharp and cold. A useless daughter who disappears when real life begins. She has no right to be here. A heavy, suffocating tension dropped over the room. The people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably on their wooden benches. Even Martin Weller looked momentarily surprised by the sheer, unvarnished cruelty of the statement. The judge looked down at the files on her desk, her face unreadable, digesting the venom that had just been spilled onto the court record. They all expected a reaction. They expected me to break down in tears, to scream in protest, or to shrink into my chair in absolute humiliation. That was the old Adeline. That was the girl who had packed her bags and fled in the middle of the night all those years ago. I did none of those things. I kept my posture straight. my breathing even, and my expression entirely blank. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I watched the triumphant gleam flicker in her eyes, a fleeting moment of victory as she believed she had successfully crushed me in front of the entire town. I slowly raised my right hand and placed it flat against the smooth leather of my slim black briefcase. The leather was cool to the touch. Inside that briefcase were thousands of pages, dozens of bank statements, and a meticulously organized timeline that would soon tear their entire fabricated existence to shreds. I did not need to speak yet. I had waited 7 long years for this exact moment. Let them have the stage a little longer. Let them build their house of cards as high as they possibly could. Because the higher they built it, the harder it would fall. I simply rested my hand on the case, breathing in the stale air of the courtroom, entirely ready to pull the pin on the grenade I had brought with me. 7 years ago, I was 31 years old. I was quiet, deeply observant, and largely considered the defective cog in the Lennox family machinery. While my parents poured every ounce of their waking energy into propping up a string of failing local businesses to maintain their social standing, I chose an entirely different path. In their eyes, choosing any life outside the tight borders of our town and the family brand was an act of profound, unforgivable disobedience. The role of the golden child had long been occupied by my older brother, Gavin Lennox. Gavin possessed a varsity quarterback smile, a firm handshake, and a terrifying inability to balance a basic ledger. He was the designated heir, the undeniable pride and joy of the family. This remained true even as he routinely drove every business venture he touched straight into the ground with reckless financial bets. When Gavin lost tens of thousands of dollars on a disastrous commercial real estate flip near the highway, my parents framed it as a bold entrepreneurial learning curve. He was just taking risks, they said. Yet, when I brought home a master's degree in forensic accounting and corporate risk management, it was met with polite, strained silence at the Thanksgiving dinner table. My parents did not understand what I did, and what people do not understand. They instinctively mock. They openly referred to my specialized degrees as useless paperwork. According to Harold and Diane, sitting behind a desk hunting for numerical discrepancies and tracing hidden assets was not practical work. Practical work meant staying in our suffocating little town, shaking hands at the annual Rotary Club breakfast, and serving the Lennox family interests until your spirit gave out. They desperately wanted me behind the counter of one of their struggling hardware stores, or managing the front desk of their dying ventures, smiling for the locals and pretending we were local royalty. The final, irreparable fracture between us did not happen over a petty dinner table debate. It happened in the cramped, dusty back office of the Lennox Community Table. It was late on a Tuesday evening in late October, and I had foolishly volunteered to help organize their tax files for an upcoming state audit. That was when I opened the master ledgers. Even a first-year accounting student would have noticed the bleeding. But to someone trained in forensic tracing, the books were practically screaming. I found phantom vendors listed for community outreach programs. I found grossly inflated catering invoices for charity galas that never actually took place. Most damning of all, I found bizarre, cyclical cash transfers that seemed to vanish into a black hole, only to loosely correlate with the dates Gavin needed bailouts for his failing property management company. I printed the documents and brought the stack to my father the very next morning in the kitchen. I did not immediately accuse him of federal theft. I simply asked for the corresponding receipts to clear up the glaring inconsistencies. The reaction was instantaneous, defensive, and violent. Harold slammed his ceramic coffee mug onto the granite counter so hard it shattered, sending dark, scalding liquid pooling across the floor. He turned a deep shade of red, his voice booming through the quiet suburban house, accusing me of trying to tear down the very charity that fed the homeless families in our county. My mother, entirely predictably, flanked him within seconds. She did not even glance at the papers I held out to her. She looked at me with a deep, theatrical disappointment that made my stomach turn. The argument rapidly spiraled into a screaming match that rattled the windows. I tried to explain the massive legal liabilities, the absolute certainty of a federal audit, and the sheer irresponsibility of whatever shell game they were playing with donated money. But Harold did not care about the law. He cared about absolute control and his fragile ego. He cornered me near the hallway, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly at my chest. He told me I was nothing but a cynical, arrogant girl who only knew how to judge people who actually built things. He looked me dead in the eye, his face contorted in rage, and shouted, "You will never be useful in the real world." I did not argue back. I realized in that exact moment that you cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you just to keep themselves afloat. I walked upstairs, packed exactly 2 suitcases with my clothes and essential documents, and left the house before the sun came up the following morning. I drove straight out of town, watching the familiar, suffocating streets fade into nothingness in the rearview mirror. I moved to Cedar Hollow, a dense, anonymous, concrete city on the opposite side of the state. I changed my phone number, blocked their email addresses, and severed the rotting ties to protect whatever was left of my mental sanity. Nature abhors a vacuum, and small American towns abhor an unexplained departure. In my sudden absence, my parents gladly filled the void with their own carefully curated fiction. Over the next 7 years, the story they fed the town was a masterpiece of tragic, long-suffering parenting. They told everyone at the country club luncheons and the Sunday morning church services that I had failed miserably in the big city. They painted me as a stubborn, aimless drifter who could not hold down a real job or maintain a relationship. The narrative they spun was that I was simply too ashamed of my own pathetic failures to come home and face the generous family that loved me. It was a clean, sympathetic story that made them the ultimate victims of an ungrateful child. But the isolation I built around myself was not entirely absolute. There was one solitary lifeline that remained intact across the years, slipping quietly under the radar. My aunt, Vivian Mercer. Vivian never once bought into the family mythology. She was my mother's older sister, but they could not have been more fundamentally different. While Diane lived entirely for public approval and the illusion of wealth, Vivian lived fiercely on her own terms in her aging, drafty in on the edge of the woods. Several months after I left, Vivian somehow tracked down my new number. She called me on a Sunday evening. She never once asked me to come back. She never tried to play the role of the family peacemaker, and she certainly never tried to guilt me into an apology. Our phone conversations became a quiet sanctuary. They were delightfully, wonderfully ordinary. She would ask if I had eaten a proper dinner that week, or if the endless city traffic was wearing my nerves down. I would ask about the stray tabby cats she stubbornly fed behind the inn's kitchen, or the chronic plumbing issues in room number 4. We talked about the changing weather, the thriller novels she devoured, and the quiet, creeping indignities of getting older. She knew I worked incredibly long hours, though I spared her the grim, exhausting details of the complex financial fraud cases I investigated for the city. She was the only person from my entire past who treated me like a functional, capable human being rather than a defective extension of the Lennox brand. It was a fragile, quiet connection, held together by brief weekly phone calls and occasional handwritten letters sent through the mail. But it was fiercely genuine. Vivian saw me, entirely and without condition. She knew I was not broken, and she knew I was not lost in the world. As I sat in that frozen courtroom 7 years later, listening to my mother spin her poisonous web of lies about my absence, I thought of Vivian's steady, gravelly voice on the phone. My parents genuinely thought my physical absence was my greatest weakness. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet, unremarkable bond I maintained with Vivian in the shadows was the very thing that would soon tear their entire world apart. It was the single, incredibly sharp needle waiting to puncture the elaborate balloon of lies they had so carefully inflated for the entire town to see. Vivian Mercer's heart gave out on a suffocatingly humid afternoon in late August. It was a rapid, quiet cascade of medical failures that ended before anyone could mount a proper bedside vigil. Naturally, Harold and Diane orchestrated the funeral with the precision of a high-stakes political campaign. They stood by the polished mahogany casket receiving condolences, absorbing the sympathy of the town like dry sponges. To the outside observer, and indeed to themselves, they were the undisputed heirs, apparent. For years, they had made it their absolute mission to be photographed beside her at every local ribbon-cutting or holiday charity drive. They cultivated an ironclad public image of devotion, convinced that proximity equated to ownership. They believed that because they pushed her wheelchair in the sunlight, they automatically owned the shadows of her estate. The illusion shattered spectacularly on a rainy Tuesday morning in early September. We were gathered in the stifling oak-paneled office of Vivian's longtime estate attorney, an aging man who smelled faintly of peppermints and old paper. The heavy rain lashed against the single frosted window, blurring the world outside. My parents sat close together on a tufted leather sofa, radiating an aura of impatient entitlement. I sat in a hard-backed wooden chair in the corner, my hands folded perfectly still in my lap. I was invited only as a legal formality, a courtesy meant to witness their triumph. The attorney adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses and broke the thick wax seal on a heavy manila folder. He began with the standard, dry legal boilerplate, his voice a low, monotonous drone. But the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted violently the moment he announced that the will had been comprehensively updated merely 4 months prior to Vivian's passing. My father shifted his weight abruptly, the leather sofa groaning beneath him. My mother stopped dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with her lace handkerchief. Then, the attorney read the words that effectively sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I was named the sole executor of the estate. I was not named a secondary beneficiary. I was not a co-manager. I was granted absolute, undivided control over Mercer's run-in, and more terrifyingly to the 2 people sitting across from me. I was given total administrative authority over her private trust and every single financial ledger attached to it. The silence that followed was dense, heavy, and highly combustible. If you only looked at the surface of the situation, their sudden outrage made 0 sense. Mercer's run-in was a decaying relic of a bygone era. It was a sprawling, drafty Victorian structure choking on overgrown wisteria, boasting a sagging wraparound porch, cracked foundation stones, and plumbing that groaned in the night. To any rational investor, it was a massive financial sinkhole. But I knew. And looking at the sudden, chalky pallor washing over my father's face, I knew that he knew. That they did not care about the rotting floorboards or the antique furniture gathering dust. They were not angry about losing a crumbling bed and breakfast. They were absolutely paralyzed by the thought of me holding the keys. Beneath the decaying wood of the inn lay the buried architecture of their own financial survival. They were terrified of the heavy, iron-forged safe in Vivian's private ground-floor study. They were sweating over the fireproof filing cabinets in the basement. Cabinets they knew held decades of unsecured promissory notes, leveraged deeds, and quiet handshake agreements they had forced upon her. The sudden shift in power was not about real estate, it was about the paper trail. Before Harold could even begin to articulate a coherent, sputtering objection, the attorney raised a single, bony finger, signaling he was not finished. He read the final, most baffling addendum of the document. It was a legal poison pill Vivian had designed with lethal precision. The clause stated clearly that should any member of her immediate or extended family contest my appointment as executor, or formally challenge my moral and legal standing to administer the estate, the probate judge was instantly instructed to open a secondary, sealed envelope attached to the master file. The contents of that envelope were to be submitted directly into the public legal record for open, unrestricted review. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat. My father's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack under the pressure. The panic in his eyes was naked, feral, and deeply revealing in his arrogant mind. There was only one logical explanation for this betrayal. He genuinely believed I had spent the last 7 years manipulating a vulnerable old woman over the telephone from hundreds of miles away. He thought I was running a slow, malicious long con, whispering poison into her ear, orchestrating this massive theft of their rightful property. He could not comprehend that Vivian was simply sharp enough and quiet enough to see them for exactly what they were. They did not even wait for the earth to settle properly on her grave. Exactly 48 hours after we walked out of that suffocating attorney's office, Harold and Diane, armed with Martin Weller's aggressive legal tactics, filed an emergency injunction with the county court to strip me of my executorship. Their legal reasoning was a masterclass in projection. They cited exactly what Weller would later parrot in the courtroom. They claimed I was profoundly estranged, geographically distant, morally bankrupt, and dangerously ignorant of local commerce. They painted a vivid picture of a greedy, absentee relative swooping in to plunder a fragile estate I did not understand. On paper, to the bored clerks processing the filings and the gossiping townspeople reading the local registry, it looked like a standard, ugly family dispute over a piece of nostalgic property. But beneath the surface of the procedural motions and the hollow declarations of family duty, it was a completely different war. It was a high-stakes, breathless race to see who could secure the perimeter around Vivian's dark corners first. My parents desperately needed to lock down the estate so they could quietly incinerate the ledgers, shred the hidden loan agreements, and erase the secret collateral documents Vivian had meticulously collected and categorized over the years. They needed to control the legal narrative before I could even turn the lights on in her dusty office. They fought so viciously not because they wanted to honor a beloved sister's memory, but because they desperately needed to bury her secrets before those exact same secrets buried them. And the terrifying sealed envelope hanging over their heads was the only thing keeping them from breaking down the inn's door with a crowbar. They were trapped in a maze Vivian had built, and I was the one holding the only map. 3 days after Vivian's funeral, I stepped into Mercer's run-in and crossed an entirely new boundary line. I pushed open the heavy oak front door, expecting the hollow, rotting ruin my mother had described to the town. Instead, the air smelled of lemon oil and dried lavender. The floors were swept. The wainscoting was intact. It was undoubtedly old and required maintenance, but it was far from the worthless. Abandoned liability Harold and Diane had loudly complained about. They had painted a picture of a collapsing structure to deter anyone from looking too closely. I bypassed the guest rooms and walked straight to the back hallway, where Vivian had kept her private office. The room was perfectly preserved, steeped in the quiet dignity she carried throughout her life. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat the real reason my family was in a blind panic. Tucked into the corner was a heavy iron safe, and beside it stood a heavy-duty, 4-drawer fireproof filing cabinet. Vivian had left the combination to the safe in a sealed letter mailed to my apartment in Cedar Hollow 2 weeks before her heart gave out. I spun the dial. The mechanical clicks loud in the empty room 34. Right to 12. Left to 58. The heavy steel door swung open smoothly. Inside, stacked with terrifying precision, was the hidden architecture of my family's impending ruin. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook. Opening it, I realized it was a daily log spanning exactly 11 years. Vivian had recorded every single interaction regarding her finances with excruciating detail. Dates, times, the exact phrasing my father used when he asked for money. But the notebook was just the index. The true horror lived inside the fireproof cabinet. I spent 6 hours sitting on the faded Persian rug, surrounded by meticulously labeled manila folders. Vivian had not just been observant, she had been quietly building a fortress of paper. I found pristine photocopies of bank statements, aggressive loan applications, secondary mortgage agreements, and increasingly desperate correspondence between my father and his former accountant. The narrative the papers told was chilling. My parents were not simply struggling with a few bad business quarters. They were drowning in a sea of toxic debt. Worse, they had weaponized Vivian's good name to keep the sharks at bay. I found a copy of a letter Harold had sent to a regional commercial lender just 8 months prior. In it, he casually leveraged the inn, promising the creditor that his wealthy, ailing sister-in-law was declining rapidly. He explicitly wrote, "The Mercer estate will soon change hands, and our liquidity will increase by several magnitudes." They had been using her impending death as collateral to secure short-term bridge loans. They had effectively sold the roof over her head while she was still sitting in the living room. The deeper I dug, the darker the paper trail became. In the bottom drawer, I found a bright red folder dedicated entirely to the Lennox Community Table. This was the charity that caused my violent exit 7 years ago. Vivian had somehow managed to quietly acquire the internal routing numbers. I traced a dizzying maze of wire transfers. Money donated for community food drives had been siphoned through 3 different shell accounts. The final destination was always the same: a catastrophic, hemorrhaging commercial land development project spearheaded by Gavin. They were bleeding the charity dry to plug the massive holes in his sinking ship. Vivian had known. She had known everything for years. Rather than confronting them and risking a violent retaliation or elder abuse, she had chosen to amputate them financially. The documents showed how she had methodically restructured her private trust, isolating a large percentage of her liquid assets into accounts my parents did not even know existed. She had silently built a wall of legal protection around the core of her estate, waiting for the precise moment to hand the keys to the only person who could decipher the blueprints. But as I sifted through a stack of municipal mail near the back of the safe, my breath caught in my throat. I unfolded a series of oversized, officially stamped maps from the county zoning board. This was the twist I had not anticipated. The maps detailed a newly approved, massive infrastructure project. The county was extending the main commercial transit route, a project that had been stalled in bureaucratic purgatory for nearly 2 decades. The newly finalized blueprint showed the expanded highway cutting straight through the desolate woods bordering the county line, right along the western edge of Mercer's Run Inn. I read the preliminary surveyor estimates attached to the back of the zoning map. If the land use rights remained intact and were sold to the commercial developers courting the county, the value of Vivian's property would not just double, it would multiply by a factor of 10, perhaps even 15. The property was sitting on a goldmine of commercial redevelopment potential. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The frantic, vicious legal assault my parents had launched was not about securing a nostalgic inheritance. It was not even about covering up their past sins. They were fighting for a highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar future they thought they had successfully stolen. Harold and Diane had likely known about the zoning approval for months. They had planned to take control of the estate, immediately liquidate the land to the highest commercial bidder, pay off their staggering mountains of fraudulent debt, and walk away as the wealthy, triumphant pillars of the community they always pretended to be. To them, I was not just an estranged daughter standing in the way of a few antique chairs. I was the locked door standing between them and absolute financial salvation. If they won the executorship, they would have the legal authority to walk into this office with a trash bag. They would shred the notebooks, burn the bank statements, and erase every single trace of the charity fraud and the predatory loans. They would sanitize the past and cash in on the future, leaving Vivian's memory hollowed out and exploited. I carefully placed the zoning maps back into the safe and locked the heavy iron door. The metallic click echoed in the quiet office, sealing the evidence back in the dark. I understood exactly what the stakes were now. If I made a single procedural misstep in Judge Price's courtroom, my family would not just win a crumbling bed and breakfast. They would completely rewrite history. And the people who spent their lives lying would win everything. I picked up my slim black briefcase, feeling the weight of the war I was about to unleash. My parents dedicated an extraordinary amount of energy to carefully cultivating the myth of my failure. For the 7 years I was absent from their lives, they painted a vivid, tragic portrait for anyone in our hometown willing to listen. To the ladies at the country club and the men at the local hardware store, I was the wayward, stubborn daughter who had fled to the city of Cedar Hollow only to crash against the harsh realities of life. They told stories of my supposed inability to hold down a steady job, painting me as a fragile, directionless drifter too, consumed by shame to return to the loving embrace of my family. It was a beautiful, sympathetic lie that cast them as the long-suffering victims of my ingratitude. The truth, however, was entirely different, and far more dangerous to their current ambitions. I was not wandering aimlessly through dead-end administrative roles. For the past 5 years, I had been the senior forensic review director at the North Pass Civic Integrity Office. It was a completely independent, highly specialized government oversight agency tasked with monitoring multi-million-dollar public contracts. My title was not a ceremonial badge. It was a testament to thousands of hours spent dismantling complex financial deceptions. My daily professional existence revolved around tearing apart the carefully constructed illusions of corrupt contractors and embezzling city officials. I reviewed massive labyrinthine expenditure records. I hunted down intricate document fraud hiding in plain sight. I traced illicit money flows that were deliberately and expertly concealed within systems specifically designed to look entirely legal to the untrained eye. I spent my weeks prosecuting the exact breed of arrogant, white-collar deception that my father, Harold, practiced as a clumsy, arrogant amateur. I never breathed a single word of this to my family. I never mentioned my promotions, my successful investigations, or the authority my signature held at the agency. I learned very early in life that sharing anything of substance with Harold and Diane was a critical mistake. If I presented a genuine achievement, they would immediately weaponize it. They would either twist it into a cruel joke about how my career was a poor substitute for a husband and children, or they would hijack my success, distorting my actual job title into something flashy and incorrect just to boast to their shallow circle of friends. To protect my peace, I erected a wall of total silence. I allowed them to comfortably believe I was scraping by in a low-level clerical position, because their utter lack of interest in my mundane fictional life kept them from digging into my real one. There was only one person on earth who truly understood the nature of my expertise: my Aunt Vivian. She knew exactly what I did for a living, and she respected the sharp, unyielding logic it required. But that was why, nearly 3 years ago, her tone shifted during one of our regular Sunday evening phone calls. She sounded unusually tired, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. She confessed that something felt deeply wrong with the internal logs of the Lennox Community Table, the charity fund my parents proudly paraded around town. She had noticed glaring discrepancies, numbers that simply refused to align with reality. She asked me, quite simply, if I would be willing to review a small batch of records she had managed to quietly photocopy during a family dinner at my parents' house. Initially, I hesitated. I stood in my apartment kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling the familiar, suffocating dread of my family's chaos threatening to pull me back under. I knew that looking too closely at those ledgers would inevitably ignite the exact war I had sacrificed my relationship with my family to escape. I tried to gently suggest that perhaps it was just my brother Gavin's notorious incompetence at bookkeeping. But Vivian was resolute. She mailed me a thick brown envelope 2 days later. When I finally broke the seal and spread the copied documents across my dining table, my professional instincts immediately overrode my personal dread. It took me less than 3 hours to spot the catastrophic red flags. I did not just find poor accounting. I found deliberate, systemic theft. I found identical, duplicated transfer amounts hitting obscure secondary accounts on the exact same dates every single month. Far more chillingly, when I magnified the authorization forms, I found distinct, undeniable variations in the signature lines. Someone was blatantly forging Vivian's handwriting to release internal charity funds directly into Gavin's failing real estate ventures. From that exact evening forward, I stopped running from the truth. I quietly began compiling a shadow dossier for Vivian. Every time she managed to secure a new piece of paper, a bank statement, or a contractor invoice, I processed it through the exact same rigorous analytical framework I used to prosecute corrupt city contractors. This was the reality I carried with me as I sat perfectly still in Judge Eleanor Price's courtroom. When Martin Weller confidently stood before the judge and painted me as an ignorant, emotional outsider who could not possibly comprehend the complexities of the Mercer estate. A deep, cold satisfaction settled in the very center of my chest. I had not walked into this legal battle empty-handed. Resting beneath my hands was my slim black briefcase. Inside that case was not a collection of emotional grievances or petty family arguments. It was a masterclass in fraud detection. It was a perfectly indexed, color-coded file, meticulously cross-referenced with bank routing data, time-stamped correspondence, and notarized timelines. It was a devastating legal weapon forged by someone who dismantled financial criminals for a living. I had arranged the evidence specifically to slice through every single syllable of perjury my parents were currently committing under oath. Yet, despite the overwhelming power sitting directly on my lap, I chose to keep the briefcase firmly shut. I possessed the immediate, undeniable ability to obliterate Weller's opening statement, to stand up, approach the bench, and present the irrefutable proof right then and there. But I held my tongue. I wanted to see exactly how far my parents were willing to go. I needed to hear the precise depths of their deception. This courtroom proceeding was no longer just a standard dispute over a dead woman's will. I had transformed it into a carefully constructed, high-stakes psychological trap. I knew the cardinal rule of interrogating white-collar fraudsters: the more space you give them to speak, the tighter they will inevitably pull the noose around their own necks. If I revealed my hand too early, they would pivot, claim ignorance, and attempt to shift the blame to a clerical error. But if I let them swear under oath that their narrative was the absolute, unvarnished truth, their subsequent destruction would be absolute and legally binding. I made the conscious, tactical decision to let them look down on me one last time. I let my mother dramatically dab her dry eyes and play the victim for the public record. I let my father smirk from across the wooden aisle, absolutely certain of his impending victory. I absorbed their venom without a single flinch or objection. I knew a fundamental truth about arrogant, deceitful people: they only ever reveal their true, darkest nature when they are absolutely convinced their opponent is weak, stupid, and defenseless. They truly believed they were backing a frightened, incompetent girl into a corner. They had absolutely no idea they were walking into a room where every lie would be documented and turned against them. The claustrophobia of a small American town is a very specific kind of poison. It does not kill you all at once. It suffocates you slowly, using the familiar faces of your neighbors and the whispered conversations in the aisles of the local grocery store. 72 hours before the trial began, my parents unleashed that poison with the precision of a military strike. I was standing in the windowless basement of the county land registry office, running my fingers over the edges of a 50-year-old property deed, when Martin Weller found me. He did not approach with the aggressive swagger he used in the courtroom. He glided between the rows of metal filing cabinets, offering a practiced, sorrowful smile that did not quite reach his cold eyes. "Adeline," Weller said, his voice a low, soothing baritone designed to project false intimacy. "I am glad I ran into you. I was hoping we could have a quiet word, away from the theater of the courthouse." I did not look up from the deed. I simply waited. "Your parents are bleeding," Weller continued, stepping close enough that I could smell his sharp, expensive cologne. "They are in a very precarious financial position. The strain of your aunt's passing, coupled with the local economic downturn, has pushed them to the brink. If this hearing proceeds, it will destroy them publicly. Gavin is weeks away from losing his commercial lease. You have the power to stop this hemorrhage today." He reached into his tailored jacket and produced a single sheet of paper, placing it gently over the deed I was reading. It was a voluntary transfer of rights document. "Sign this," Weller urged, his tone shifting into something resembling a gentle reprimand. "Step away from the executorship. If you have even a fraction of a conscience left for the people who raised you, you will walk away now and let them salvage what is left of their lives. Do not force them to humiliate you on the public record." I stared at the blank signature line. It was a brilliant, classic intimidation tactic. Isolate the target, appeal to a distorted sense of familial duty, and offer a quick exit to avoid an unspecified public slaughter. I calmly picked up the document, folded it precisely in half, and handed it back to him. "I will see you in court, Mr. Weller," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I walked past him, leaving him standing in the dusty aisle. But the assault did not end in the registry basement. It merely shifted mediums. By the time I returned to my temporary motel room on the outskirts of town, the digital smear campaign was operating at maximum capacity. My phone buzzed constantly with the collateral damage of a small-town rumor mill. People I had not spoken to in nearly a decade suddenly felt entitled to weigh in on my morality. The overarching narrative was identical across every platform. The ungrateful daughter, having failed in the city, had caught the scent of vulnerable money and returned like a vulture to pick over her dying aunt's bones. An old high school acquaintance sent me a direct message containing a screenshot of my mother's latest social media post. Diane had posted a nostalgic, softly filtered photograph of herself holding Vivian's hand in a hospital bed. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive martyrdom. It read, "It breaks a mother's heart to realize she raised a child who only remembers the meaning of family when there is a will to be read, praying for peace during this agonizing betrayal." The post had hundreds of sympathetic reactions. The entire town was collectively organizing a digital witch hunt, eager to burn the prodigal daughter at the stake to protect their beloved local philanthropists. But right in the middle of that suffocating wave of public vitriol, a critical piece of the puzzle quietly slipped into my hands. It arrived as an encrypted message from a local commercial contractor named Elias. Elias had done extensive repair work for Gavin's failing property management company and had always possessed a quiet, observational intelligence. His message was brief, nervous, and entirely devastating to my parents' timeline. "Adeline," the message read, "keep your guard up. Harold tried to sell off the commercial copper wiring and the heavy generators from the old Lennox warehouse to me 3 weeks ago. He offered a massive discount for straight cash. When I asked for the title to clear the sale, he told me not to worry because he would soon control Mercer's Run and could use the inn as collateral for my payment. He promised me the estate was a done deal. 3 weeks ago. Vivian was still alive 3 weeks ago. I immediately opened my laptop and bypassed the secure firewall of the public records database I used for my agency work. I did not need to sleep. I needed to trace the desperation. If Harold was promising collateral, he did not yet own to local blue-collar workers. He was undoubtedly making much larger, far more dangerous promises to institutional lenders. I cross-referenced my father's recent corporate filings with the short-term lending agencies operating in our county. Within 4 hours, I found the anomaly. It was a quiet, aggressively leveraged bridge loan filed with a predatory lending firm known for charging upwards of 20% interest. The loan was massive, easily enough to temporarily plug the gaping holes in Gavin's commercial real estate disaster. But the most crucial detail was the collateral listed on the preliminary application. Harold had submitted a deeply flawed, unexecuted draft of a power of attorney document. It was a piece of paper Vivian had explicitly refused to sign 2 years prior. A document that would have granted him total control over her financial estate. Harold had presented this rejected draft to the desperate lenders as a pending guarantee, essentially borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars against a legal fiction. The sheer arrogance of the maneuver was breathtaking. If they won the executorship hearing, they could instantly validate that fraudulent loan. They would use their newly acquired legal authority to retroactively approve the collateral, washing the dirty money clean through the legitimate channels of the Mercer estate. They were not panicked, grieving relatives reacting emotionally to an unexpected will. They were calculating fraudsters who had spent months executing a premeditated financial heist. They had spent the money before the vault was even open. And my sudden appointment as executor had violently derailed a train that was already speeding down the tracks. Their absolute, fatal mistake was looking at me and seeing the ghost of the girl they had bullied out of town. They believed I was still the fragile, easily intimidated young woman who simply ran away when the yelling started. They thought the social isolation of the town, the theatrical cruelty of my mother's online posts, and the aggressive posturing of their expensive lawyer would be enough to make me break and sign away the estate in a dark basement. They had no concept of the woman I had become. They did not understand that intimidation only works on people who do not know how to read the paperwork. I closed my laptop as the sun began to rise over the motel parking lot. I made a conscious, ironclad decision. I would not reply to a single text message. I would not post a defense on social media. I would not confront Elias or Martin Weller or my mother in the streets. I would absorb every ounce of their public slander and let them build their false confidence to absolute maximum capacity. I would let them walk into that courtroom believing they had already won the war. Because the only thing more satisfying than catching a liar is letting them lock the door from the inside before you strike the match. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom sealed shut, trapping the stifling tension inside the room. From the moment the bailiff instructed us to be seated, Martin Weller took absolute command of the floor. He did not behave like a man defending a desperate, heavily indebted couple. He moved with the smooth, predatory grace of a high-paid litigator who had already written the final verdict in his head. His strategy was immediately clear. He was going to bury me under a meticulously curated avalanche of fabricated devotion. Weller approached the podium, resting his hands lightly on the polished wood. He spoke to Judge Eleanor Price with a tone of deep, resonant respect, painting a picture of a family tragedy that had only one logical villain. "Your Honor," Weller began, his voice carrying perfectly to the back rows of the crowded gallery. "We are not here to debate the cold, mechanical text of a legal document. We are here to protect the very real, very human legacy of Vivian Mercer. For the last several years of her life, as her health rapidly deteriorated, she was entirely dependent on the physical, emotional, and financial support of her sister and brother-in-law, Diane and Harold Lennox." He turned and gestured toward my parents. They sat at their table, the perfect image of exhausted, grieving caretakers. Weller unclasped a thick white binder and handed a copy to the bailiff to pass to the bench. "I have submitted Exhibit A into the record. This binder contains a comprehensive timeline of devotion." He began to walk the judge through the evidence, piece by piece, It was a terrifyingly clean presentation. He projected glossy photographs onto the courtroom monitor. There was a picture from 3 Christmases ago, showing my parents standing by Vivian's wheelchair in the parlor of Mercer's Run. There was a photograph of my father carving a turkey 2 Thanksgivings ago, smiling warmly beside the aunt I supposedly abandoned. Photographs are merely moments in time, Your Honor. Weller continued smoothly, pacing in front of the bench. But the financial and physical reality of caretaking is written in the receipts. In Exhibit B, you will find documented proof of my client's unwavering commitment. We have submitted invoices for a massive roof repair conducted at the inn 2 summers ago, arranged and overseen entirely by Harold Lennox. We have included dozens of pharmacy receipts spanning the last 48 months, proving that Diane Lennox was the one driving through the snow to ensure her sister had her vital medication. He did not stop there. He produced 2 sworn notarized affidavits from neighbors who owned property adjacent to the inn. He read passages aloud, emphasizing the parts where the neighbors swore they saw Harold constantly mowing the lawn, fixing the porch steps, and carrying heavy groceries through the front door. It was a brilliant, suffocating narrative. Weller was not just proving they were present. He was building an impenetrable wall of moral authority to the gallery sitting behind me, and perhaps even to the clerk recording the minutes. My parents looked like local saints who had sacrificed their golden years to care for a dying relative. Then came the emotional performance. Judge Price permitted my mother to speak to the emotional toll of the estate management. Diane did not stand up aggressively. She rose slowly, gripping the edge of the table as if her legs could barely support her weight. She pulled her lace handkerchief from her pocket, pressing it gently to the corner of her eye. "Your Honor," my mother said, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper that demanded absolute silence from the room. "Vivian was my blood. She was my older sister. When she got sick, there was no question about who would step up. Harold and I gave up our evenings, our weekends, our own peace of mind, because that is what family does." She paused, taking a ragged theatrical breath. She turned her head just enough so the gallery could see her profile, the portrait of a wounded matriarch. "But the hardest part," Diane continued, letting a single, perfect tear fall, "was watching Vivian wait. Every Thanksgiving, we set a beautiful plate at the table. We placed it right next to Vivian, and every single year, we stared at an empty chair. Adeline never called. She never sent a card. She left us to carry the entire burden. And now she walks into this courtroom to claim the house we kept standing." A low murmur of sympathetic whispers rippled through the wooden benches behind me. The townspeople were buying every single word of the tragic script. My father decided to strike while the iron was hot. Harold leaned into his microphone, his voice dropping into a harsh, bitter register. He bypassed the sorrow and went straight for character assassination. "She always thought she was smarter than the rest of us," Harold stated, glaring at the side of my face. "She sat in her room with her books and her theories, looking down on the people who actually worked with their hands to feed this family. She has never built a business. She has never lifted a single finger for anyone but herself. She is entirely self-serving. To push the humiliation to its absolute peak, to ensure the insult was permanently etched into the court transcript, Diane looked directly up at Judge Price and repeated the exact phrase she had used to break me all those years ago. "Your Honor, it breaks my heart to say this under oath," Diane said, her voice suddenly devoid of tears, cold and sharp. But Adeline is a useless daughter who disappears when real life begins. She has absolutely no right to touch my sister's legacy. Throughout the entire character assassination, I stayed silent and took notes. A yellow legal pad lay open in front of me, and I wrote down every date, every claim, and every lie they wanted on the record. Each time Weller presented a falsified receipt, I marked it. Each time my mother performed her grief, I added another line. My absolute silence acted like a powerful stimulant to the opposing table. Weller puffed up his chest, his posture growing increasingly relaxed and dominant. My parents exchanged a quick, triumphant glance. They interpreted my lack of reaction as paralysis. They thought they had successfully drowned me in a sea of public shame and fabricated evidence. They were absolutely certain I had no counterattack. Judge Eleanor Price, however, was a completely different variable. She sat high above us, her face an unreadable mask of judicial neutrality. She listened to the weeping and the accusations with the exact same expression she used to read the technical legal briefs. She did not nod in sympathy with my mother, nor did she scowl at me, but her silver fountain pen paused in the air, and she leaned forward slightly when Martin Weller made his final, most critical summation argument. Ultimately, Your Honor, this is a matter of practical competence, Weller argued, tapping his finger against the podium. Even if we set aside the profound moral failings and the deeply painful estrangement, we are left with a simple, undeniable fact. Adeline Lennox possesses no significant experience handling complex property management or intricate corporate bookkeeping. To hand her the reins of the Mercer Trust would be an act of gross financial negligence. I stopped writing. I stared at the yellow legal pad. That was the moment. That was the specific, fatal mischaracterization that would bring their entire house of cards crashing down. As I listened to the echo of Weller's words fade into the high ceilings of the courtroom, I realized the fatal flaw in their entire strategy. Their story was simply too perfect. It was entirely too clean. They had sanded down all the rough, chaotic edges of reality to present a flawless, sterilized narrative of absolute devotion and absolute villainy. Real caregiving is messy. Real financial management leaves unpredictable footprints. But their exhibits were perfectly chronological, their emotions perfectly timed, their receipts perfectly legible. It did not look like real life. It looked exactly like a highly choreographed presentation built by people trying entirely too hard to hide something massive. My moment to strike was imminent. The psychological trap I had set was fully loaded. They had sworn under oath that they paid for the roof. They had sworn under oath that they bought the medication. They had sworn under oath that I was financially illiterate. They had woven their own legal noose with expert precision. But I did not open my briefcase yet. I kept my hands perfectly still. I needed the trap to be completely inescapable. I watched Diane wipe her eyes one last time, waiting patiently for her to say just one more sentence, one final, arrogant lie about the origin of those funds, to slam the lid of their legal coffin entirely shut. Judge Eleanor Price shifted her gaze from the petitioner's table and looked directly down at me. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the lingering echo of my mother's theatrical insults. "Miss Lennox," Judge Price said, her tone professional and entirely neutral, "the court will hear your response to the petition for your removal as executor." I stood up slowly. I did not offer a tearful preamble. I did not rush to defend my character or address the vicious personal attacks my father had just hurled across the room. Emotional defenses only validate the attacker's premise. Instead, I simply reached down and unlatched the 2 silver clasps of my slim black briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks cut through the stifling air of the courtroom. I withdrew a thick, meticulously organized binder. It was not a loose collection of sentimental photographs or frantic, scribbled notes. It was a professional-grade forensic dossier. It featured heavy plastic dividers, perfectly aligned color-coded tabs, and a comprehensive index grid printed on the first page. I handed 3 identical copies to the bailiff, instructing him to distribute 1 to the bench, 1 to the court clerk, and 1 to Martin Weller. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and completely devoid of the dramatic tremble my mother had weaponized minutes earlier. "If the court would please turn to the blue tab, labeled Section 1. I heard the synchronized rustle of heavy paper as the judge and the opposing counsel opened their binders. The petitioners have built their entire argument on the premise of my complete absence and total abandonment, I stated, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Under Section 1, you will find dozens of handwritten letters and certified postal receipts spanning the last 7 years. These are letters written by Vivian Mercer. In them, she explicitly details our ongoing, weekly communications. More importantly, she documents the specific administrative tasks I performed for her remotely. You will see clear references to me reconciling her annual property taxes, auditing her liability insurance for the inn, and holding secure digital backups of her critical estate documents. Martin Weller frowned, his eyes scanning the letters rapidly, searching for a forgery or a loophole. He found nothing but the undeniable, sloping cursive of the woman they claimed I had ignored. "If you move to the green tab, Section 2, I continued, not giving them a single second to recover, you will find a chronological series of bank transfer confirmations and cleared checks. These are not from the Mercer estate. These were drawn directly from my personal checking account in Cedar Hollow. Over the last 4 years, I personally covered the emergency repairs to the inn's boiler system. I paid the supplemental premiums on her hazard insurance. I covered the out-of-pocket deductibles for her cardiac medications. The total financial contribution exceeds $25,000. I did not attend the holiday dinners because I was working double shifts to ensure the roof over her head did not collapse, while my parents were busy carving turkeys for the camera. The murmurs in the gallery behind me vanished instantly. The townspeople, who had been softly whispering their judgments against me just moments before, were suddenly struck dumb. To address the petitioner's claims regarding my professional incompetence and alleged inability to handle complex financial matters, please turn to the yellow tab. Section 3, I said, my voice ringing clear and sharp. Judge Price flipped to the designated page. It was a formal, notarized letter of employment verification printed on heavy government cardstock. For the past 5 years, I stated, looking directly at Martin Weller, I have served as the Senior Forensic Review Director for the North Pass Civic Integrity Office. My daily professional responsibilities involve auditing multi-million-dollar public expenditure contracts, identifying sophisticated document fraud, and tracing concealed financial assets through complex, layered corporate systems. The entire atmosphere of the courtroom shifted so violently it felt like a drop in barometric pressure. Judge Price looked up from the document, her eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. She looked at me, reevaluating everything she had just been told. It was immediately and painfully clear to everyone in the room that I was not confused. aimless drifter who had stumbled back into town looking for a handout. I was a professional investigator who dismantled financial lies for a living. Martin Weller practically leaped out of his chair, his smooth composure fracturing for the first time. Objection, Your Honor. A person's current employment status does not automatically dictate their legal or moral right to inherit an estate, nor does it excuse years of physical absence. Judge Price looked down at him, her expression hardening into something resembling cold steel. It does not dictate inheritance, counselor, she replied dryly. However, it speaks directly and overwhelmingly to the credibility of your client's sworn testimonies regarding the respondent's financial literacy, general competence, and overall capacity to execute a complex trust. Objection overruled. Proceed. Miss Lennox. Weller sank back into his chair, the color draining from his face. He looked at the binder sitting in front of him not as a legal document, but as an active, explosive device. Finally, Your Honor, I said, stepping slightly out from behind my table. If you would direct your attention to the red tab, Section 4. This section directly addresses the receipts and invoices Mr. Weller submitted in his Exhibit B to prove my parents' financial devotion. My father suddenly shifted his weight, the heavy wooden chair groaning beneath him. The physical invoices for the roof repair and the pharmacy bills are entirely authentic, I explained, holding up my own copy of the index. The shingles were indeed replaced. The pills were indeed purchased. However, if the court reviews the magnified bank routing and account numbers printed at the very bottom of those exact receipts, a completely different reality emerges. Those payments were not drawn from Harold or Diane Lennox's personal accounts. Every single cent was drafted directly from Vivian Mercer's own primary checking account. My parents simply physically drove the checks to the bank. They did not pay for her care. They spent her own money and are now attempting to present it to this court as an act of personal sacrifice. My mother's hand dropped from her face. The lace handkerchief fluttered onto the table, entirely forgotten. Furthermore, I pressed on, tightening the psychological snare I had spent the last 3 days building. If you cross-reference the exact dates of those specific, highly visible property repairs with the financial disclosures in Section 5, a very clear, very disturbing pattern emerges. My father initiated those repairs on the exact same days he submitted applications for high yield, short-term commercial bridge loans from private lenders in this county. I looked directly into my father's eyes. They were wide, frantic, and filled with a sudden, overwhelming panic. He was not acting as a devoted caretaker trying to keep the rain out of an old woman's bedroom, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. He was using the physical maintenance of Mercer's Run as a behavioral smokescreen. He was artificially inflating his moral standing in the community, building a pristine, documented profile of devotion specifically to prepare for this exact legal dispute. For the very first time in my entire life, I watched my mother's perfect, impenetrable facade completely shatter. Diane Lennox lost her composure entirely. She did not look angry. She looked terrified. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She stared at me from across the aisle, the devastating realization washing over her in real time. She finally understood that I was not just defending my right to an inheritance. I was surgically, methodically dissecting the entire structure of the fraudulent reality they had built their lives upon. And I was doing it on the permanent public record. They had walked into the courtroom expecting to crush a helpless victim. only to realize too late they had locked themselves inside a cage with the very person holding the key to their destruction. Judge Eleanor Price set my heavy forensic binder to the side of her elevated desk. The silence in the room was no longer merely quiet. It was absolute, ringing with the kind of tension that precedes a massive structural collapse. She looked down at Martin Weller, who was currently staring at his own copy of my dossier as if it were a live explosive device. His polished, predatory swagger had completely evaporated. "Mr. Weller," Judge Price said, her voice cutting cleanly through the stifling air, "in light of the respondent's formal contestation, and considering your clients have explicitly challenged Miss Lennox's moral and legal standing to administer this trust, the specific conditions outlined in Vivian Mercer's final will and testament have been unequivocally activated." She turned slightly and gestured to the court clerk sitting directly below her. "Bring me the master probate file. We are opening the sealed addendum." The clerk retrieved a thick, heavy manila envelope bound with a dark red wax seal and handed it up to the bench. Every single eye in the packed gallery locked onto that piece of paper. The townspeople behind me stopped shifting in their wooden seats. My father abruptly stopped breathing. My mother gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. They knew exactly what they had been doing in the dark for the last several years, and they were currently watching the courtroom lights turn on. Judge Price slid a silver letter opener under the flap and broke the wax seal. The sharp snap echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. She extracted a sheaf of dense, heavily notarized pages and a smaller handwritten letter. She adjusted her reading glasses, smoothed the pages flat against her desk, and began to read aloud for the permanent public record. "This letter serves as a binding legal directive," Judge Price read, her tone perfectly measured but carrying a terrifying, undeniable weight. "If my brother-in-law, Harold Lennox, or my sister, Diane Lennox, initiate any legal proceedings to remove my designated executor, Adeline Lennox, I instruct this court to immediately launch a formal, comprehensive review into the risk of gross asset misappropriation." The judge paused, turning the first page. "I did not choose Adeline out of blind, sentimental affection. I chose her because she is the only person in this entire family who knows how to look at the papers instead of the excuses." The letter did not stop at philosophical observations. Vivian had compiled a meticulous, chronological ledger of their aggressive, parasitic maneuvers. Judge Price read through the catalog of their quiet greed. She detailed 3 separate occasions where Harold cornered Vivian in her own private parlor, aggressively pressuring her to sign guarantor release forms for his failing retail ventures. She read a passage describing Diane crying in the inn's kitchen, begging for direct administrative access to the primary trust accounts under the transparent guise of wanting to save Vivian the trouble of writing checks. Most devastatingly, the judge read a specific note regarding my brother. Vivian explicitly detailed a conversation where Gavin loudly boasted about using Mercer's run-in as collateral for a massive commercial loan. A conversation that occurred while he was standing right in Vivian's own driveway, acting as if she were already dead. Then came the revelation that drove the final, unbreakable nail into their legal coffin. Attached to this personal statement, Judge Price continued, her eyes scanning the dense financial appendix included in the envelope, "is a preliminary investigative report. Exactly 6 months prior to my passing, I privately retained the services of an independent forensic auditor." Martin Weller physically flinched. The high-paid litigator actually dropped his expensive silver pen, letting it clatter loudly against the wooden table. The auditor was specifically tasked with reviewing the operational cash flow of the Lennox Community Table Charity Fund, the judge read, her voice growing noticeably colder. Their preliminary findings strongly indicate a systemic, cyclical diversion of charitable funds into private commercial accounts managed by Gavin Lennox. It was a perfect, devastating echo. The private auditor Vivian had secretly hired had uncovered the exact same fraudulent architecture I had discovered 7 years ago. The truth was now officially entered into the court record, backed by a licensed third party. But Vivian had one final, lethal observation. Judge Price looked up from the papers, her expression hardening into absolute judicial fury. Furthermore, the deceased notes a profound suspicion regarding recent loan applications filed by Harold Lennox in the county. She formally requests the court to investigate the high probability that her signature was illegally duplicated and reused from old, discarded tax files to support unapproved credit applications. Martin Weller scrambled to his feet. His arrogant demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a man trying to stop a tidal wave with a paper cup. "Your Honor, please," Weller stammered, his rich baritone voice cracking under the sudden pressure. "This is highly irregular. These are unverified. Paranoid allegations made by a woman whose mental acuity was clearly declining in her final months. I respectfully request an immediate adjournment to review these shocking claims before they prejudice this court any further." "No," I said. I did not yell. I did not stand up. I simply spoke clearly, cutting him off before he could build a temporary escape route. I pulled a single, extremely thin folder from the very back of my briefcase. I handed it to the bailiff, who immediately carried it up to the bench. "Your Honor, there is no need for an adjournment to verify the deceased's suspicions regarding my father's loan applications," I stated calmly, looking directly at the judge. "I am submitting Exhibit C into the record. These are copies of direct, time-stamped email correspondence between Harold Lennox and the regional director of a private, high-yield lending firm. They are dated exactly 4 weeks before my aunt suffered her fatal heart attack." I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with my father in those emails. Harold explicitly promises the lender that he has already secured total operational control of the Mercer Trust. He promised them the inn as collateral a full month before Vivian Mercer passed away. He was illegally spending the money before she was even in the ground. The pressure in the room finally cracked the weakest vessel. My father shot up from his chair, his face a violent, mottled purple. He completely forgot where he was. He forgot the judge. He forgot the packed gallery of his neighbors. And he forgot the permanent court record being typed just feet away. "Who gave you those emails?" Harold bellowed, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "Those were entirely private communications. Who the hell leaked those to you?" The entire courtroom froze. The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. Martin Weller closed his eyes and slowly buried his face in his hands. By screaming that question, by demanding to know my source in a fit of blind, arrogant rage. My father had just inadvertently authenticated every single page in that folder. He did not deny the emails existed. He did not claim they were forged. He only cared about how I got my hands on them. In his panic, he had publicly confessed to the exact timeline of fraud I had just presented. I sat back in my chair, looking at the chaotic, smoldering ruins of my family's reputation. The true shock rippling through the crowded room was no longer about the fact that I possessed a meticulously organized file. The profound, breathtaking realization hitting everyone in the gallery was that Vivian Mercer had anticipated every single arrogant move they would make. She knew they would challenge me. She knew they would lie under oath. She knew they would try to use her memory to steal her future. So, she let them dig their own grave, and she left the shovel right in the middle of her final will, perfectly wrapped and waiting for the exact right moment to bury them. For exactly 14 minutes, Judge Eleanor Price said absolutely nothing. The silence in the Franklin County Probate Court stretched out, taut and fragile, like a piano wire pulled to its absolute breaking point. She systematically turned the heavy pages of my forensic binder, meticulously comparing my documented evidence against the explosive contents of Vivian's sealed envelope. The only sounds in the vast, stifling room were the rhythmic rustle of thick paper, the faint ticking of the wooden wall clock, and the ragged, increasingly panicked breathing coming from my father's side of the aisle. Martin Weller sat completely immobilized in his chair. The high-priced attorney looked entirely hollowed out, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table in front of him. He knew his lucrative legal career in this county was currently standing on the edge of a massive, crumbling cliff. Finally, Judge Price closed the master file. She slowly removed her wire-rimmed reading glasses, placed them carefully next to her wooden gavel, and folded her hands. She did not raise her voice by a single decibel. Yet her words struck the silent room with the undeniable force of a physical blow. After a thorough review of the sworn affidavits, the financial disclosures, and the deceased's explicitly authenticated directives, Judge Price began, her cold eyes sweeping over the petitioner's table. I find the petitioner's claims to be entirely without merit. Furthermore, I find their presentation of financial evidence to be profoundly misleading and deeply disturbing. She paused, letting the heavy weight of the word misleading settle permanently over my parents' shoulders. Then, she delivered the final, undeniable judgment that altered the entire landscape of our family history. Miss Lennox is not the unstable party in this courtroom, the judge stated, her voice sharp and absolutely resolute. She is the only one who appears to have behaved like a fiduciary. A collective, shocked exhale rushed through the wooden benches of the gallery behind me. The townspeople, who had spent the last 3 days enthusiastically condemning me as a greedy opportunist, were suddenly forced to swallow the bitter realization that they had been expertly manipulated by the town's most prominent liars. I hereby dismiss the petition to remove Adeline Lennox with extreme prejudice, Judge Price declared, bringing her gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. The final will and testament of Vivian Mercer remains in full, unrestricted effect. You are the sole executor of this estate, Miss Lennox. If the ruling had ended in that exact moment, it would have been a massive, validating victory. But Judge Price was not finished reading the blueprints of their destruction. She picked up her silver fountain pen, her judicial expression turning incredibly severe. However, the court's business regarding this estate is far from concluded. She continued, given the severe, documented discrepancies regarding the origins of the property maintenance funds, and the deeply concerning allegations of unauthorized loan collateralization detailed in the deceased's sealed addendum, I am issuing an immediate, comprehensive judicial freeze. My father physically slumped in his chair, the last remaining trace of color draining completely from his face. Effective immediately, Judge Price ordered, looking directly at Harold Lennox. All financial accounts, real estate transfer records, and commercial development contracts associated with Mercer's run in and the overarching Mercer Trust are completely frozen. Neither Harold nor Diane Lennox, nor any of their affiliated corporate entities, are permitted to access, transfer, or leverage any asset tied to this family line. My mother let out a tiny broken gasp, realizing the millions of dollars from the impending highway development project had just been locked firmly behind an impenetrable legal wall. Furthermore, the judge added, striking the final lethal blow, I am ordering the court clerk to immediately transfer the entire file of contested signatures, the alleged guarantee letters, and the documented bridge loan transactions directly to the County Division of Civil Fraud Assessment. This is not a criminal indictment today, but the court finds sufficient probable cause to warrant a deep, formal investigation into gross asset misappropriation. It was a total death sentence for their public reputation and their personal freedom. They had walked right into the courthouse expecting to secure a lucrative commercial real estate deal. They were walking out directly into the crosshairs of a massive government fraud investigation. The collateral damage of their own staggering arrogance had finally caught up to them. Court was officially dismissed. The gallery immediately erupted into furious, hushed whispers as the townspeople scrambled toward the heavy oak doors, eager to spread the shocking new reality across the entire county. I remained seated, methodically packing my documents back into my slim black briefcase, across the aisle. Diane Lennox slowly stood up. The theatrical, grieving mother act was completely gone. The prop lace handkerchief remained abandoned on the dirty floor. She turned and looked at me, really looked at me, for the very first time in my entire life. Her eyes were wide and filled with a profound, terrified clarity. She finally recognized that the quietness she had always mocked, the introversion she had consistently branded as severe weakness, was actually a masterclass in controlled, lethal silence. Harold practically lunged across the aisle, his hands shaking violently. He did not look angry anymore. He looked exactly like a cornered animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. Adeline, my father choked out, his voice hoarse and thoroughly desperate. Adeline, please, let us just go outside. Give us 10 minutes. We can talk about this in private. You do not understand the kind of financial trouble we are in. We can make an arrangement. I snapped the 2 silver clasps of my briefcase shut. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal gray suit, and met his panicked gaze with absolute, chilling indifference. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a dramatic, screaming monologue of revenge. Vivian gave me a job to do, I said quietly, ensuring only he and my mother could hear the finality in my tone. And for the first time in my 38 years, I am going to do it without asking for this family's permission. I turned my back on them and walked steadily toward the exit. But as I reached the heavy wooden doors, I noticed something entirely unexpected. The gallery was mostly empty, but resting on the very edge of the wooden bench where my older brother, Gavin, had been sitting, was a small folded piece of yellow legal paper. Gavin had slipped out of the courtroom entirely unnoticed the second the judge mentioned the charity fund audit. I picked up the paper and unfolded it in the hallway. It contained a single address written in Gavin's messy, frantic handwriting. It was the location of an off-site commercial storage unit located out on Highway 9, followed by a 4-digit access code. Beneath the security code, he had written a single, terrifying sentence. There are more files. I am sorry. The emotional twist settled heavily in the center of my chest. The massive fraud we had just exposed in the courtroom was not the bottom of the ocean. It was merely the surface. My father had hidden a secondary archive, and the golden child, realizing the entire ship was actively sinking, had just handed me the coordinates to the rest of the buried bodies. I walked out of the courthouse, leaving the chaos behind, and drove directly to the edge of the county line. The late November air was biting and sharp as I pulled my car onto the gravel driveway of Mercer's Run Inn. The sprawling Victorian house stood quietly against the backdrop of the darkening winter woods. The wisteria vines clung perfectly to the old porch columns. I walked up the wooden steps, my heels clicking softly against the solid floorboards. I did not feel the loud, explosive rush of a cinematic victory. I felt a deep, profound sense of permanent quiet. I stood entirely alone on the wraparound porch, the cold wind brushing against my face, and looked down at the heavy brass key resting safely in the palm of my hand. For decades, I had allowed their bitter voices to dictate my worth. I had internalized their constant, biting criticism. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, I realized the absolute truth. I never needed to prove I was useful to people who only knew how to build their own lives by tearing mine down. My parents came to court this morning determined to prove to the world that I was a useless daughter. They left paralyzed by the terrifying reality that I was the one holding the absolute truth, possessing the power to completely collapse the entire fraudulent life they had built on lies. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. And please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. I also invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.